Good day. My son and I are bored because of the quarantine, so we're making some videos. And there's lots of information out there on yoke making, but we just want to do like a really high level video on yoke making and some of the basic steps and walk you through the progression of making a yoke. And I think the first thing to mention when you're making any yokes, I'm no expert, I've done it for a while just for my animals, but there's very little specific science to it. I think you've got to remember that if you're afraid to do it, don't be afraid, just jump in and do it. All over the world, if you look at people using cattle for draft animals, sometimes they just have a log between them with some, straight bows on each side just to keep the log centered on the animal's neck, and then we have more sophisticated yokes all the way up to head yokes. But if you're making just a basic neck yoke, sometimes just jumping in and doing it is all you need to do. So I'm not going to get into specific species of woods and different things in that nature, but I'll show you some blanks. The blanks that I have some yellow birch and cherry that we've been working on, mostly cherry, and I'll show you step by step the progression and some different techniques that you can use to make a yoke. But again, just jump into it and don't overthink it. Just try to do it and work on one the best way that you can. So the first step is obviously you need a block of wood, and depending on who you talk to, you can get specific dimensions, dimension lists. If you want to email me, I can get you the dimension lists that I use. But again, we're not dealing with precise technology here. If you're off a little bit, a quarter of an inch, a half inch here or there, you're generally going to be okay until you get into the real extremes. If you're a real heavy puller, or you're doing 10 hours a day of farm work with your animals and you want a perfect yoke, that might be a different discussion. But for most of us, it's a hobby. We do work around the farm and stuff with them or in the woods, so we do want a good yoke. But again, it's going back to my previous statement of not overthinking it. So right here we've got a blank cherry. This is one that I actually cut in the woods here and rough cut it out with a chainsaw. Most of mine I'll just send to the mill, so I'll get them the length that I want using whatever dimension guides that I use. Leave myself enough trim on each side and then create a rectangular blank. Now the first step is going to be to trace the shape of the yoke that you want on the blank. So I've got a series of cardboard templates that I've used. You can use an old yoke. You can draw one side out from the center of the belly to the end of the neck in a shape or a pattern that you think is going to work, and then just duplicate it by tracing it on the other side. So you just need something to make sure that you get a proper yoke shape with the right size neck and everything, and then translate that onto the block of wood, keeping the top of the neck onto close to the top of the block so that you can transfer everything over. And then again, just do it on the other side. I have some patterns that are full yokes. To me, having a half pattern is easier because you get it symmetrical. So if I do one half, trace it out, and then match it up and put it over, then I get a symmetrical tracing when I finish. So that's literally the first step. So here's the next step in progression. This is a 5-inch yoke that is traced onto this block. And remember, you can always take material out. So like I said before, if you leave yourself plenty of trim, even if it's a little wider than you think you want, a little bit taller, that's fine. You can always take material off, you just can't put it back on. So this is a 5-inch yoke, so we got 5 inches between the bow holes, which hopefully everybody knows. That's how we measure out a yoke. And we need some way of getting the holes transferred off to the top of the block, or at least the markings for them. So you'll see here, this is one that's already been drilled. So when I determine, I always start with the inside measurement. So here's my 5-inch measurement. I put some scribe lines there, and then literally all I do is translate those with a square, and I do my inside lines first, and then I cheat. So I use a paddle bit for most of these holes. If I know the inside lines, I put it up against here and trace the outside and the center. This is obviously a larger drill bit, and then I can do the same thing on the other side. And again, just like with everything else, the hole sizes here are going to vary. In the patterns that I have specific hole sizes that slowly get larger the larger the yoke gets. But again, that's something that varies as well. So if you only have an 1.5 inch bit, and my patterns call for you know, 1.25 inches, I'll probably just use 1.5 inches. If it's a little bit bigger, it's okay. Again, there's no specific science to it. Now once we have our pattern marked out, we have our holes, the centers for our holes marked out, the next thing that we need to do is drill them. Now obviously the easiest way to do that is on a drill press. If you have a drill press, the main thing is to make sure that the holes are perfectly parallel with one another. So if I measure 5 inches here and I go all the way through, you don't have to go all the way through, you should at least drill to the bottom below the neck obviously. But when I cut this out, I want 5 inches here and I want 5 inches here if this is a 5-inch yoke. So doing that freehand can be very difficult. You need some level of drill press or jig or something to keep those holes straight. But that's going to be your next step, is while we've got everything traced out, we're still in the form of a wooden block, we're going to next drill those out. So now we've drilled the holes, we've marked the yoke. The next thing that we need to do is cut it out. And this is where it can be a challenge depending on the size of the yoke. If I have a 5-inch, it's pretty easy. If I have any level of bandsaw, up to a 6 or 7-inch yoke, depending on the size of the bandsaw, unless you have a really big one, that's typically the easiest way to do it. For me, I don't have a big enough bandsaw, so anything above about a 7-inch, this is an 8, I end up using a chainsaw. And using a chainsaw is actually, if you practice a couple times, it's easier than you might think. It's another thing where you kind of just, if you're good with a chainsaw or you have one, you should just jump in and try it. The main thing obviously is making sure that your cuts are nice and even, and that you don't go crooked one way or the other. You may have to make some cuts up and down vertically, and then take a hatchet or something and cut out between them so that you get the big chunks out. But you'd be surprised if you don't have, as long as you don't have a huge saw, you can get most of this cut out. And again, it's going to be pretty rough, but you'll get the basic shape of the yoke. And as long as we've drilled the holes enough, we'll have our holes all the way through. We want to make sure that we go through enough with our drill bit, and just do a little bit at a time. It may take a little bit of practice, especially as you're cutting, you know, things. If this is a good example, if we look at the top here, and this yoke is cracked, it's not a really great yoke, but if I'm cutting this edge off on the end of the neck, you can see I left myself pretty much, you know, 1/2 inch of trim here around that, so I don't go beyond my line. But when we start cutting it with the saw, we want to make sure that the bar of the saw, as we cut through, cuts a nice straight and even line, and then we follow through with the rest. If I start cutting at an angle, and you see instead of a straight line, we've got an angle like this where we've cut, then things are going to start getting off. So we need to make sure that we pay attention to how we're doing that. But whether you're using a bandsaw, a chainsaw, just follow your lines, make sure you have plenty of trim, cut off as much as you can, and then any other big pieces, you can start using a hatchet and cutting away at this. That's how they did them 200 years ago, 100 years ago. They would use a broad axe and start cutting pieces off. If you have an adze or something else like that, or even just a hatchet, you can start taking the big chunks of material off so that you generally get the shape that you're looking for, which is what we have here. So obviously, once we've initially cut this out and we've used a chainsaw on this one, we've got a lot of rough areas here that we need to take up. And again, you can start by hitting it with a hatchet. I also prefer to use as much hand tools as possible. I'm not a huge power tool guy, but even if we start taking pieces off with a draw knife, taking larger chunks off using that and a hatchet, that'll get you down to your general shape. And then one of the best tools that'll come in handy with making yokes is this Sureform rasp. And these, you can find these at any hardware store, but they typically come with a flat rasp file. This is a 1/2 round. You can find them on Amazon. They're real easy to find on Amazon. I have a harder time finding them at the local Home Depot or anything like that. But this will allow you to take and smooth everything out. So once I get, you know, the big chunks of material out and I'm left with kind of what I have here, I'll go through this with the rasp. And the advantage of this is you'll start seeing all the high spots being cut down, and it'll become a lot smoother. So technically speaking, if you cut this out with a chainsaw, you maybe use the draw knife to take more material off, and then you started using the rasp, you can actually get to a point where you're ready to sand after that. It'll be pretty close to being finished. The other nice thing about the half round rasp that we can use is we can do our necks and start making the curves around the neck, and we can go and do the other pieces of the yoke as well, where there's a curve or an inside radius that we need to smooth out. So when I do feel like cheating, and I can use an angle grinder, and there's lots of wood discs for angle grinders. These are the best that I found for a couple of reasons. They're cheap. They're very inexpensive. I buy them at Harbor Freight. They're 40 grit, just a flat disc, basically a sandpaper disc. And you'll go through a couple of them as you're making a yoke, but if I'm going to use power tools, this is typically what I'll do. So after I cut it out and get it roughed out, I will go over the whole yoke with the angle grinder and this flapper disc and take off all the high spots so that it's basically smooth. It's not going to be perfectly smooth, but it'll be basically smooth. We take all of the really rough stuff off. And then what we do, this is one that's kind of in the next stage, is once I get all of the rough portions off of where I've cut it with the chainsaw, and I take the flapper disc and I smooth it all out, then what I do is I take my rasp and I go over it. Even if I've done the flapper disc, I'll still get little divots and it won't be perfectly even. And what this does is it allows me to smooth everything out, and I can take all the high spots off of it. And you'll be surprised, you know, this will get you 75% of the way there, this will get you to 95% of the way, and then you can sand it from that point. But it's just going over it with this disc, getting all the super rough pieces off, getting the high spots off with the rasp, and then from that point you can sand it. Now, once we get the basic shape of the yoke, we obviously need to round off the necks so that it's comfortable for the animals. We determine which side is the front and which side is the back. It's typically how I do it. This is the good side. There's quite a few flaws on the back side on this one. So for the front side, I make this front radius of the neck smaller than the back radius. This will actually be radiused more on the back of the neck, and that's because this is what the animals are pushing up against. So it's more important that this side has that deeper radius in it. And I do that with the rasp. You can actually form it with this as well, but you're better off going over it with the rasp after, just to smooth everything out. And then I cut all the edges, round everything over, and take out little bits at a time and make sure that I haven't cut one end too far or the other. It's basically eyeing it at that point. Again, it's just use your rule of thumb on exactly how you think it should come out and try to get to that point. I take some out of the belly. You know, I'll take weight off of it where I can. This one still needs to be finished, but you know, a little bit at a time. Remember, you can't put material back on, but you can always take some off. And then after we've smoothed everything out, usually, again, I'm cheating a little bit using power tools, but I take a belt sander, start with like an 80 grit, and then work to a 120 and get this nice and smoothed out the rest of the way. And do the entire yoke so that it's nice and smooth. And then as I go, if I have to take more material off somewhere, I will. And then from that point, you're really done as far as the major work with the yoke. So what you should end up with is something that looks like this. This is a 5-inch yoke. You'll see that these are both cherry. One looks a little darker than the other. And that is because after every time you work with the blank and start forming it, really after any time you do anything with it, you should put boiled linseed oil on it. So just rub down the wood with boiled linseed oil, and then it'll bring out the color, and it'll also keep it from cracking. And even if it does have some small cracks, it'll kind of bring itself together as well if we linseed oil it. Some of the larger yokes, you may want to drill some holes for bolts to stabilize the wood. Obviously for your hardware, you're going to have to drill holes. You can go straight from the top down through the bottom of the belly for the staple, or you can have a piece of steel or iron that comes around the bottom and bolts through the middle, just whatever your preference is. And then we make rings out of old coil springs for cars, and that tends to work the best. And we'll typically have 2 rings, one for a pole, for a cart, and then one for a chain. But after that, with bows, I'm not going to get into bows today. It's a little bit more complicated because you got to bend them and stuff, and you know, we do that as well. But again, the biggest suggestion I can give to you is don't overthink it with a yoke. Get some patterns, find out how you want it built, get a piece of wood, jump into it, and just have fun with it. Try it on your animals and make sure that it fits right, and that's really it. It's not that complex.